Alright, today we're going to be doing an in-depth image quality test of the Canon 28 through 105. Now I've done a previous review on this and I've done some comparison videos, but throughout all of YouTube I don't know of a single in-depth image quality test of this lens, on YouTube. So, I'd like to make one of those, so for people interested in the specific performance of this lens, I'd like to, give you some options, what it will look like. Now to start off, I took all these pictures on an 18 megapixel APS-C size camera. I shot at the neutral picture style and they were all at ISO 100. Now I shot all these pictures at a very bright sunny day, so I didn't use any unrealistic settings whatsoever. These are all very realistic shutter speeds. So this is definitely the sort of performance you will see if you actually use this lens yourself. Now before we crop in anywhere, one of the things I first see here is the severe chromatic aberrations we're seeing along the side of this tree. Now here we are at its widest angle of 28 millimeters, which on APS-C is more along somewhere in the high 40s, and we're at the widest aperture of the lens, which is f3.5, and this lens does not have a constant maximum aperture, so that maximum aperture will be diminishing as we move on. Now, as I said before, look at this tree. Now I can see the optical flaws going on in the corners here without even cropping it at all. This is totally digitally zoomed out. This is the whole picture, and I'm not, like I said, I'm not cropped in at all, and I can already see that the corners are terrible. Now this would be bad enough if I had cropped in all the way and saw this sort of performance, but to see this flat out without zooming in at all, that is pretty bad, to be honest. Now let's take a more close look at this tree here, and when you crop into it, it's way worse. It's extremely soft. Like I said, the chromatic aberrations on this sort of contrasting light and dark is pretty terrible, to be honest. Now this is an extremely cheap lens, so if anyone doesn't realize, this is a $100 used lens, so I consider this lens, if anything, an alternative to the 18 through 55 kit lens. I kind of talked about that in my review of it. And this is sort of the image quality you will be getting with the 18 through 55, so watch my review for more information, but, for $100, a zoom lens with this sort of very useful zoom range, it does its job. I wouldn't expect it to be fantastic, so just keep that in mind. This is not, this is not a lens you get for perfect, fantastic image quality. There are other reasons that I like this lens. Now let's take a look in the center here, where of course the image quality we'd expect would be a lot better, and thankfully it is noticeably better. It is not very good by any stretch of the imagination, but is definitely noticeably better. As you see, there's a lot of contrasting dark and light here. So kind of some of these flowers here, and some of the, this darker area with the fence, and I'm not seeing nearly as much chromatic aberration. So there is a stark contrast between the center and the corners, even on APS-C. Now this is, having such a difference between the corners and the center is definitely something you'd be more akin to in a full-frame image. So, I can't even imagine what the performance in the corners is like, and you see the extreme corners on a full-frame. Now, sharpness-wise, there definitely is a noticeable increase over the corners, but again, it's not a very sharp. Now let's move on to the next shot. Now it's again at 28 millimeters, but I've stopped it down to f4.5, so it's still on the wider end of the aperture range for this lens, but it's not as wide as it was before. Of course, it's not a ridiculously wide aperture like it was. Not the 3.5 is crazy, but as you'll see, the maximum aperture range will get narrower and narrower as we go on. Now let's go back to that tree we were looking at before and see if it improved at all. And there's definitely some improvement in sharpness. I'm not going to say it's good. I'm not going to say it's drastically better. Some of the chromatic aberrations don't really seem to be spreading out as much. I kind of feel like at the wider aperture they definitely kind of spread out a little bit more. But again, that's still terrible. And again, let's crop out all the way. It's still visibly bad, which is really bad. Now let's take a look at the corners. Sharpness-wise, I'm not seeing any real significant increase. What I am noticing is I'm definitely seeing a lot more detail in this fence area here. It was a lot harder to distinguish in the last picture between where the fence stopped and where these sort of trees started. So again, not a massive improvement, but it is definitely some improvement. Now here we are at the next image. This is stopped down to f6.3. So again, it's just kind of in the mid aperture range for this lens. It's not really a very narrow aperture, and it's not very wide by any stretch of the imagination. So again, keep it consistent. Let's start off looking at that tree in the corner because it's been giving us a lot to talk about. And I'm seeing some improvement in the chromatic aberrations. Again, they're there, they're very present, but I don't really see them stretching out as much. Sharpness-wise, I'm seeing a mild increase, but again, nothing drastic whatsoever. Looking in the corners, the center, it basically looks the same to me. I can see no real improvement in sharpness or anything in the center. I see no added detail or anything like that. So this is one of those situations where if you were going to shoot at f6.3 or f5.6 or whatever, you might as well go down to f4.5 for that extra light gathering and possibly that extra shallow depth of field, which doesn't really matter at 28 millimeters, but you might as well take it because you're not really sacrificing any of the image quality by going wider. So that's just kind of my take on it. Now let's move on to the last picture at 28 millimeters, and that is at f9. So this is kind of a narrower aperture, and you're probably not likely to go any narrower than this. So for the sake of this test, this was the narrowest I got as f9. So again, keep it consistent. Let's take a look at that tree in the corner, and I don't see any improvement whatsoever from f6.3. I'm just going to move on to the center. It looks the same. It really has looked the same for basically all these pictures. So at 28 millimeters, this is a bad performing lens. Again, so is the 18-55. If that's what you have, maybe you've tried that and you're content with that, this is not a worse lens than that. This is not a worse performance. That, like 2 at its wider angles, had very, very bad performance. But for some people, especially maybe if you're just doing video where you're not going to be cropping it all the way all the time, depending on what you want. Like I said, I consider this lens kind of an alternative to the 18-55 kit lens. So again, just looking at it compared to that, considering it has so many advantages over the 18-55, I'm not going to complain. Compared to other lenses for $100, you can get lenses with much better image quality, but that's just how it is at 28 millimeters. So let's kind of move on here to the next shot. Now from here I've zoomed it into 50 millimeters. Again, I want to remind you this is on APS-C, so that adds up to be somewhere around the 80 millimeter range. Now let's look in the center to start off with. And I'd say I'm seeing a slight improvement in sharpness before. There is slightly more detail in the sort of bush here. Again, nothing drastic whatsoever. It's still pretty bad, but I'm seeing a moderate improvement. Now, let's just see what the maximum aperture has become now that we've zoomed into 50 millimeters. So it's now f4, so it's only, very, very, it's right near f3.5. It's not that much narrower whatsoever, but I should point out that at this point already you have lost some light gathering. Now let's take a look in the corners here and see how they look. Let's go to this up top here, and I'm not seeing that stark of a contrast between the corners and the center as much anymore. Here we are on the in the left top corner now, and I'm seeing definitely some softness here, but it's definitely not such a great difference as it was at 28 millimeters. So let's move on to the next picture, another one at 50 millimeters, and I believe this one was also taken at f6.3. Let's just make sure. f5.6. Alright, now let's take a look in the center. And I'd say I see a mild improvement in sharpness. Again, it's really not that good, but you take what you can get. Corners. I do actually see a lot more detail than in the last picture. These branches did not look nearly as good at the last aperture, so that's definitely something. So there's a mild improvement. Again, for the sake of practicality, you might want to just use that slightly wider aperture because the increase in image quality is so insignificant at this point. So let's move on to the next picture. Just check to make sure we're at which aperture we're at now, and we're at f9. So this is going to be the last picture we took at 50 millimeters. Let's go back to the center. Now we're at a relatively narrow aperture, and I'm not seeing any real change in the center. Let's go up to the corners, and I'd say I'm seeing again a little bit more detail in the extreme corners. So basically throughout the entire aperture range at 50 millimeters, you're only going to see minor differences in the corner. The center basically stays bad. Which again, compared to considering this lens is this cheap, I'm not going to sit here and complain about that. Now here we are zoomed in quite a bit more. I believe this was taken at 70 millimeters. Let's see if this will tell us. 72 millimeters. So yeah, so it's about there. So we're definitely kind of more now on the more telephoto end of this lens. Now, and here we are, the f-stop now, the maximum aperture is f4.5, so since 50 millimeters we have lost even more aperture. So let's take a look in the center. And I'd say I'm basically seeing the same results I saw at 50 millimeters. Now kind of in this background area here, I'd say it might just be a kind of like a placebo because we're zoomed in a little bit more. I'd want to say that we're seeing a little bit more detail kind of in these sort of darkened areas, but it's, if anything, it's so minor it's not even really worth going about. Let's move into the corners here. And well, I'd be honest, I'd say the corners at 70 millimeters are looking worse than the corners at 50 millimeters, which is kind of surprising. If anything, I think they'd be the same, if not slightly better, but this is looking more like what they were at 28 millimeters, so that is I'm not very happy with that. That's not very good. Now let's move on to the next picture at about 70 millimeters, and I believe this was taken at f6.3 or 5.6. 5.6. All right. Now let's take a look here. Center. I'd say I'm seeing a little bit more sharpness. Again, it's not great, but it's there. But again, it's not going to make a drastic difference. Corners. These branches are killing me. That's terrible. Like, that's really, really bad. It looks like some of these trees have a little bit more, a little bit less softness, so again, very, very mild improvement. It's not significant whatsoever. Again, since the image quality of this lens is not fantastic anyway, it seems that the trend is you might as well take the added softness and get the extra light gathering to get a better shutter speed or a shallower depth of field or whatever. That just kind of seems to be what I would do for this lens, because since this lens is not a fantastic performing lens, to really impress people with it, you're going to need to get a nice shallow depth of field, and this can give a very gives very pleasing out of focus elements. It actually gives very nice, but it's not very easy to get any sort of out of focus elements, because not because of the aperture as much as it has a relatively far minimum focus distance of I believe 50 centimeters, which is definitely so you're not going to be able to do anything macro-y with this lens. So basically, if you want to really impress with the images here, you're going to have to make sure you're getting a nice shallow depth of field, and make sure you're not going to have people wanting to go look in every little detail, every corner. Let's just move on to the next picture. I believe this is going to be the last picture at around 70 millimeters. I believe we're going to be at f9 now, but I'll make sure just to be 100% sure. Yep, we are at f9, and let's take a look here. Corners, if anything, they look a little bit worse than they did at a f5.6. Assuming center. Now let's go to the corners, and I'd say I see moderate improvement in these branches, and these sort of branches here. Again, I'm not seeing, again, very minor. Like I said, you might as well keep it as wide open as possible to get that shallow depth of field, because that's really going to give you the best looking shots from this lens, is ones where you're going to have a nice blurry background or nice blurry foreground or whatever the picture calls for. Now here we are zoomed in, I believe all the way. We're down to, up to 105 millimeters, which of course is the maximum focal length of this lens. Now on APS-C, this is more along the lines of 170 millimeters. I believe, to be exact, it's 168. So again, it's not a ridiculous telephoto reach even with the crop sensor, but you're definitely getting some zoom with this. Now let's take a look in the center, and it's definitely a little bit more sharpness than before. I'm definitely seeing a bit more, definitely a little bit more detail. this is kind of the first time I could kind of say there's some detail now. I'm actually liking this a lot more. Corners, that is horrid. That is disgusting. But considering the added sharpness in the center, again, everything I mentioned, not going to complain. Now, let's look at the, what, did I even check what aperture this is? f5.6. Okay, so that maximum aperture is still yeah, I totally forgot. The maximum aperture of this lens becomes f4.5, which is actually really good, because most lenses, especially cheaper zooms that go to a telephoto angle, by the time they're here, they're already at 5.6 or 6.3. So the fact this retains f4.5 is very, very helpful. Right, now let's move on to the next shot here. Here we are at, I want to say, f5, yep, f5.6. Let's take a look in the center. If anything, I'll be honest, I think it looks a little bit worse than it did at f4.5. I mean, this is I'm definitely seeing a little bit more kind of purple fringing, which is kind of surprising. If anything, I think this is where the lens would give me the best performance. And the corners here, especially these branches, are still absolutely horrid. Now, I mean, just like, I can understand, I'm perfectly fine, you know, with cheap lenses when you zoom in all the way and you know, there's blatant optical flaws. But when you see, like, that sort of crap, you know, at just the picture how it is, like, this is clearly, this would be seen on your camera's little LCD screen, you know. You know, that's kind of the stuff that bugs me with these, like, again, it's cheap lens, I expect there to be very significant optical flaws. But, you know, the sort of things you're going to have to watch out for are these very, very visible, terrible areas. Like I said, you know, make sure you're, you know, it all depends what you're taking a picture of. Like, this is kind of like a totally backlit, so that kind of doesn't help these sort of branches here. But, you know, make sure you know what you're taking a picture of, and sometimes you will find little spots here that just look terrible, but, you know, again, if you know what you're doing, you can definitely make this lens look pretty good. Now let's move on here to, I believe are we at f9 now? We are at f9. Let's take a look in the center. And I'd say it looks a little bit worse than it did at f5.6, which looked worse than it did at f4.5. So I'm surprised. Look at the corners. I'd say there's some improvement. There's definitely some improvement. So basically, overall, what do I think of this lens? I'd really recommend checking out my review for the physical features of this lens for if you want to know how the autofocus is and whatever. But as an optical lens, this is a bad lens. There's no way around this. This is a bad performing lens. No matter what you do on the zoom range or the aperture range, there's going to be optical flaws. There's just no way around it. But like I said, I consider this lens best as an alternative to the 18-55, an alternative to a kit lens. You know, some other kit lenses are like 28 through 90s if you're talking about film cameras on Canon. So, you know, compared to these other very, very cheap zooms, you know, I wouldn't expect anything else. That's fine. And this lens does have a lot, you know, I'm making this lens sound very negative, but I'd recommend watching my review because there are some very, very, very strong positives that I really do like about this lens. So again, I thank you very much for watching. I mean, I hope this was very helpful. And if you'd like to see any more of these sort of in-depth image quality tests, I can do these for any of the lenses I previously reviewed. I haven't, you know, some lenses I've talked more in depth in the actual reviews, but if you want a dedicated image quality review, image quality test, excuse me, of any of the other lenses that I've reviewed, definitely leave a comment. These are very easy videos. No editing really is required, so they're easily to do. I definitely like to help people whenever I can. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope this was helpful.